Adrian Lowe, the Director of Talent Analytics at Grainger, Brian Weemhoff, the Global HR Analytics Leader at Caterpillar. And our moderator is our very own Manuel Cuevas Trizon, the CHRO of Northwestern. I'll turn it over now to Manuel.
Thank you so much, Deborah. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today. So as the title suggests, and some of the marketing for the event suggests, I think more than ever now, given the groundswell of social justice and the impetus for advancement of social justice across organizations and in society at large, I think most stakeholders for all types of organizations expect that organizations demonstrate through proof points that they are committed to advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion through measurable progress. In that context, workforce data analytics offers an opportunity to truly advance diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we are very, very lucky to have true subject matter experts today in that field, and that put data science at the service of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what I like to do is to begin with what I call a personal touch question, and asking each one of you, starting with Adrian, what was your journey into workforce science?
Sure, and I would say that journey actually started at Northwestern. Go Cats!
Go Cats!
Where I was doing my MBA, I guess, coming on 12 years now, and going in like a lot of others, I was open-ended as to where I would end up, and I saw that everyone wanted to do consulting and finance and brand management. And I was thinking, how many more brand managers do we need? But there's so few of us interested in HR, I think 3 in total in my class. But a lot of the case studies we read, whether it was operations or strategy, had to do with human capital. A lot of the speakers who came in spoke on the same topic, and how that was really a challenge for them to have the right talent to execute on their business. So for me, I was thinking that could be a great niche, bringing in a business perspective, my analytical background, and from there I've been steadfastly pursuing this road, starting with PwC as a consultant and then moving on to some other organizations internally.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. How about you, Brian?
Yeah, sure. So I consider myself an HR business partner by trade. And so started out as an HR business partner. And when I went back to get my MBA, ended up kind of looking to make that jump over into the people analytics space, and held that role for a while back at Sears, did the similar work over at Aon, and then have been at Caterpillar for the last couple of years. So I think the business background and application definitely comes in handy, but I'm kind of a little different than the other folks on my team that are deeper data scientists, data statisticians, IO psychologists, and so forth. So I bring a little something different to the table.
Wonderful, thank you. Rajesh, you have a slightly different background than our other 2 panelists, and we'd love to hear your journey as well.
Sure. Well, first, I'm definitely not qualified to be on this panel. I don't consider myself talent analytics expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm hoping to share some, let's say, hard-won insights and lessons learned as we've been taking a data-driven approach to building what is a very different kind of organization at Ultranauts. We're a fully virtual company that is incredibly diverse. We have teammates in 25 states across the US. 3/4 of our employee base is on the autism spectrum, but we're diverse around across many dimensions. 38% of our team are cisgender males, 40% of our team are cisgender females, 22% of our team are trans, non-binary, and so on. We're diverse in terms of race and ethnicity. 30% of our team are people of color. We're diverse in terms of socioeconomic status. 3/4 of our team were unemployed or unemployed. And the same with mental and physical disabilities. And we're needing to build a high-performing engineering organization that can compete and win. And there was no blueprint to follow. And so as engineers, we've been experimenting and tinkering with kind of fundamentally redesigning the workplace and the work systems and core business practices. And I'm happy to share more about that later on.
Absolutely, and we will definitely explore it. I think it's an exciting story, and there's real learnings for us in terms of perspective, right? How you go in when there's no blueprint, perhaps the benefits of that, right? Of having a blank sheet of paper and taking a look at our organization in a completely different way. So we will definitely explore that. What I'd like to do is ask Adrian what I would consider to be a twofold question. And really from the perspective of a workforce data scientist, uh, what would you consider to be the starting point for an organization that finds itself stuck, that has attempted multiple goes at advancing DE&I and find themselves stuck? And the second part of the question would be, what obstacles, if any, do organizations like yours and teams like yours encounter in the process of leveraging data science to advance D&I efforts?
Yeah, sure. And I think that's a great question, especially where we are. So I only joined Granger a little over a year ago, and the DI function was established at that time. So I can't really speak to how it was before, but to my understanding, the company has been very conservative about releasing DI data when there isn't actually a DEI strategy. So we were very, I think, responsive in terms of just providing on an as-needed basis what business leaders requested, but not being very deliberate about it, and certainly not proactively putting data out there. Now, a year and a half later, with the energy around DEI, with a brand new DEI function, lead, and strategy that just came out, now is the right time for us to be deliberate, right, and be proactive. And one of the pillars of that DEI strategy is data transparency. So for us, we even focused on making visible the current state of the key dimensions of diversity. The business leaders, the HRBPs, they're frankly not asking us for extremely advanced, predictive research studies. Like, they want to understand, like, if they were to focus on key measures, what are they and what's actionable and how can we set targets? So we just don't need to get that advanced at this point. We just want to make sure that the data, there's integrity behind the data, and we're building the tools, and we're being very careful about how we're releasing them. So a lot of the need is around foundational data like hiring, turnover, engagement, internal promotions, sliced in different ways. So we've self-built a Power BI tool, which has been quite successful. And we're also really investing in creating a strong point of view as to how that data should be used. So, how would we go about benchmarking? What are the different sources? What are the flaws in benchmarking? What other inputs do you have to consider? And how do we think about target setting? Because we found that in the organization, people tend to sometimes rush to a target without really thinking about what it means. And in the case of DEI, we really want it to be actionable, given that there's true investment that is following. But behind the scenes, we are trying to get ahead of the more foundational data. We're building a model around really understanding what are the gaps. So if we were to have a target in place, how can we consider time constraints, promotions, hiring, labor market availability, to really be able to figure out on a yearly basis what are we targeting in terms of hires and promotions. We're also using text analytics and statistical analysis to dive deep behind inclusion and equity pillars, taking deep dives into our performance data, our compensation data, as well as engagement survey results, and even the text within performance ratings to uncover biases.
Wonderful. So, and that is, and I think this is something that there's a lot to unpack in your answer, and a lot of different avenues that you could follow with your answer. But one thing I would encourage all our audience members who may come from organizations that have different levels of sophistication, system capability, is what you've mentioned about focusing on the foundational data, right? Most organizations have the data. They may not have ideal systems, but with that foundational data, as long as you ensure integrity, there's a lot that you can start doing and start building on those building blocks, and eventually move towards better investment.
Right, and you also, the second part of your question is around challenges. I think in terms of DI data, stakeholding has never been so important. So I spend more of my time stakeholdering with legal, DEI, HR business partners, and the business than for any other project, making sure we have the right guideposts, making sure people are taking the right action or drawing the right assumptions. And so I think that that's been the greatest challenge for us, because our team is small and the business has many functions, right? And we don't want them to draw the wrong assumptions and data. So we are out there being consultants. And that's just a challenge with the amount of data that that is now available, and just the true appetite for that data to make sure it's really being used the right way.
So I think that raises an interesting question, and I'll turn to Brian to pick it up where Adrian left it off. This whole concept of stakeholdering, right, and leveraging the moment. There's this impetus towards advancing and measurably advancing the E&I within organizations, and many organizations find themselves both in the process of broader transformational efforts, whether it's systems, financial systems, HCMs, and I understand that in the case of Caterpillar, you are leveraging one of those all those moments to bring to bear the power of data analytics. So from that perspective, and in that effort to transform, how do you think that people analytics can effectively advance an organization's DE&I efforts?
Yeah, so I think it's really about using data to understand what dynamics are at play, and understanding how we can drive actual measurable change where there are biggest opportunity areas. With a tool that may highlight some of it for us, and sometimes there's data that's more readily available, but in some cases it's a little bit more elusive, especially when it comes to some of the measures around inclusion. So some of the steps that we take is to try to put in front of our leaders, or help our leaders understand where we have the biggest opportunity in the space of our diverse workers, what data we have, what we want to go after, and what we can actually measure. Because sometimes what we have or what might be interesting, isn't necessarily the right path. And so kind of helping them explore where those opportunities exist and what we can measure. Also understanding what we're doing well. So we may have some wins that are already out there, and there may be some other areas that are bigger opportunity areas for us, and effectively prioritizing where we want to implement certain interventions or deploy certain solutions, and effectively measure that process, and then look at where we have some of those wins and what we've implemented, and if we see success, be able to scale it more broadly across the organization. One of the things I think from our experience is that we understand that it's often going to require us to challenge ourselves and think outside of our traditional processes and practices. We may have been doing things a certain way for a period of time, and just because we've done it that way, it may have led to an outcome that may be more favorable if we think outside of the box to some extent. And so we also want to embed that understanding of how doing things differently can drive inclusion in ways that we can actually measure. And that we can also ensure that we're tapping into the value of all of our employees and any kind of implementations or any interventions we put in place, and also ensure that we're effectively tapping into the talent, all of the talent across the market, and ideally are seen as an employer of choice for diverse talent. Our CHRO will say if they're not coming to Caterpillar, they're going somewhere else. So we want to make sure that we're looking both internally and in how we're positioning and providing the employment experience in a way that will draw talent and keep talent at the company.
That's great. I have a couple of quotables there, so thank you very much. And I think that's a great segue into Rajesh, and specifically, when you're talking about looking for the greater opportunity and looking at things differently, right? And in the case of Ultranauts, I think different is in its DNA, based on just high level numbers. that you've presented. But Rajesh, I would be keenly interested, and I think our audience will be as well, of trying to understand how you came to view diversity general, but more specifically neurodiversity, as an opportunity rather than a challenge.
Sure. So Ultranauts as a company is on a mission to demonstrate that neurodiversity is a competitive advantage for business. So it's at the core of who we are and what we're trying to do and why we exist. And neurodiversity as a term was coined in the late 90s by Australian social scientist Judy Singer, but it's a framing. It frames neurological differences like autism, dyslexia, ADHD as naturally occurring variations in the human brain, not as disabilities, but simply as differences. And when you can harness those differences and bring together different brain types, different information processing models, different thinking styles, and forge collaborative teams, your intuition will tell you you're going to do better, and you're right. You could solve more complex problems, you could surface more unique insights, you could drive continuous improvement. And the world that most businesses are operating in today requires all of those things. We're in incredibly complex operating environments with constant change, and so in order to thrive, any organization really does need to embrace neurodiversity. And at Ultranauts, we're showing the kind of results you can deliver. We work with a wide range of Fortune 500 firms. For a small startup, companies like AIG, Berkshire Hathaway, Bloomberg, Bank of New York, Comcast, Cigna, Warner Media, and then startups like Slack. And we've been growing at 50% a year. Last year, we took a hit in Q2, like many organizations did. We recovered within a quarter and ended the year having grown our top line by 70%. And this is because of, not in spite of, the kind of cognitive diversity of our team and our ability to ingest complex domains and add value to our clients. Nobody's doing us any favors. We're competing on equal terms. And so, for us, neurodiversity is at the core of the competitive advantage that we believe we have. In order to kind of unlock that advantage, though, you have to put the work in to create a context where all of sort of these different brain types can thrive and collaborate. And I think that's where the really interesting work is happening right now.
Well, and I find it fascinating that you frame it in terms of brain types, right? Because especially when we talk about a knowledge economy, it really is that breadth of the brain power that makes a difference. And it also, reminds me of this myth that unfortunately still prevails in some ways of thinking, that diversity is a way of lowering standards rather than directly associated to innovation, growth, inclusion, and better opportunity overall. So that's a phenomenal, and we'll dig a little deeper on that. So let me go back to Adrian, and I think you and Brian also mentioned this concept of measuring, right? And of course, that is the expectation, that we as organizations are going to be able to come back to our stakeholders, whether they're internal employees, shareholders, boards of trustees and directors. I'm particularly interested in the process of selecting what to measure. And so from your perspective, are all talent metrics equal? And if not, how do you steer your clients? You mentioned how you work with different stakeholders within your organization to focus in the talent metrics that matters for purposes of advancing diversity.
Sure. So I think it's quite easy, and it probably does make sense for the business to focus on elements of hiring and representation, turnover. Of these, I find hiring the most actionable, and so we've partnered with talent acquisition function to build tools and Power BI to really dive deep into applicant data, to look at the full funnel from screening to interview to hire, looking at differences by source, and of course looking at through dimensions of DEI. We've been working with them as well to set targets in relation to interview slates. So that's the point where we feel like TA can most influence to bring applicants to be considered, right, in order to drive impact on a representation. But what I really try to emphasize, because there's just so much energy around, I think, talent acquisition, is that you can't just focus on external hiring. You have to balance that with a focus on internal movement, on understanding the strength of your pipeline. And so we're really making sure we're putting metrics out there that looks at whether we're moving diverse individuals into leadership roles, into people managers, senior leadership roles, and understanding, is the source internal versus external. And then we're also looking to develop tools that provides analysis at the role level. My hope is that we can help talent acquisition as well as talent development to see which roles and at what levels do we have that strong pipeline to make the decision deliberately to go internal or external, and where we have gaps to make an intervention, right? As part of that, we haven't cracked it yet, but we're trying to figure out, can we build a system where we can track that movement of individuals or cohorts? So, if you want to have a strong pipeline of leadership, you have to start all the way from college. So, for instance, for a function that's investing in women college hires, how can we really, be able to track them, their development, the promotions, their retention through every year, and be able to compare that against other populations or the impact of development programs. So that's very much an area of emphasis for us.
Excellent. And so that points to making sure that organizations look at their present level of capability, right? Your organization, Granger, may be on a certain journey. They may have made certain systems investments, and each of our organizations find themselves in a different place within that journey. So with that in mind, Brian, if when companies and institutions are in the process of making those investment decisions, whether it is in building a team, investing in a new HCM system, or simply trying to optimize what they already have. It sounds to me that this is not something that you as a people analytics expert can do alone, and it's more like a team sport. So if that is the case, what would you think is the optimal way for organizing that capability, whether it's the human capability of the talent analytics team, and also organizing other groups of people with a stake in reporting in gaining those insights?
Yeah, and I like the reference of it as a team sport because it really needs to be for it to be effective. And so, as I think you mentioned previously, Caterpillar's made an investment and implemented a new HCM, human capital management solution, which has allowed us to put a great deal of talent insights in the hands of HR partners as well as business users, where they previously had to rely different ways of pulling reports out of different systems that didn't always yield the same results. But I would say with or without an investment in a solution such as that, I think it's definitely important to emphasize people analytics as a key functional capability for HR professionals. HR function over time has moved beyond the traditional role of personnel and operational support that it's played over the years, and the need has evolved to be able to consult differently to effectively support the business around targeted talent and business outcomes. And so at Caterpillar, we've specifically defined this as a capability among a number of others that we've launched to the HR community in the last year. And we've been actively building on them across the function. It's also supported with a link to community, as well as leadership and support from our team, the people analytics team at the center. And by community, I think there's an opportunity for us to play a role as leaders, but also kind of knowledge transfer and people being able to start to position themselves as analytic HR business partners. And so from the center, we can support not only building the capability, but then also some of the more advanced project-based work that supports different business initiatives. And it also kind of plays into how HR will be consulting differently with the business and driving ownership by business leaders as well, and using talent analytics, for different opportunity areas. And I would say for most business leaders, they're already there in terms of the capability and expectations around using data and insights to drive their business, but it's a new concept for them, or at least for some leaders, to do that in the talent space. And I think the other thing that we're doing, back to that kind of team sport and thinking about it throughout the cycle, is that we're effectively weaving in DE&I lens into all of our processes, from hiring to compensation, talent, succession, engagement, and so forth, so that it doesn't, diversity does not sit within its own kind of separate function or island or separate consideration, but it's something that we're all thinking about in all that we're doing.
And to restate and emphasize that last point, what I heard, Brian, is when you're this concept of weaving, right, or weaving that thread, it's really a life cycle approach, right? You're not just looking at hiring, and again, I think Adrian was implicitly alluding to that you cannot just look at hiring. You have to look at promotion. You have to look at internal movement of the talent. That's fantastic.
Yeah, there's definitely ways where we get more surgical, and and in certain areas around hiring or promotions and so forth. But yeah, it's definitely something that is a life cycle approach.
Right, and then being more targeted, which both of you alluded to, right, where you have insights that you may not have had before. They allow you to be differential in your investment, right, and be much more targeted. That's fantastic. Rajesh, I think as we talk about targeted investment, we tend to think about the different aspects of the life cycle, but there's one aspect of that permeates the entire life cycle, which is the experience of the workplace itself, right? And there's a lot written and discussed about how you need to build a truly inclusive environment, both in terms of the configuration of offices, in the way assignments are shared, the way people work with each other. And I read a feature about Ultranauts, fairly recent, in which you were quoted as saying that you and the founders of Ultranaut aim to create, and I love this quote, a universal workplace. What exactly does that mean, and how does that vision advance diversity?
The universal workplace is a shorthand for applying universal design principles to designing the system that is the workplace, including kind of the core business practices and processes and tools, and ultimately the norms that evolve over time. I will say, while there's a lot written, there's a lot of noise and a lot of advice and sort of papers on inclusion, there's some basic questions that are still open. What is it? How do you define it? And more importantly, how do you measure it? And we're a bunch of engineers, so this is important, so that you can make informed decisions about what the problem is you're trying to fix. The other kind of gap, I would say, is that a lot of efforts around inclusion and diversity tend to focus on point solutions, and sort of accommodations for one group or another group. And as you might imagine, that's not tenable. It doesn't. You end up focusing a lot of attention on creating band-aids that don't actually solve the underlying problem, and then you end up actually avoiding getting to the root cause. And so the idea of a universal workplace is not to create a workplace for autistic talent or for female engineers or for people of color. It's to create a workplace that fundamentally levels the playing field for everyone, so that everyone has a fair shot to thrive. And so what that means for us is that there's four kind of dimensions to this idea of a universal workplace. One is flexibility is the norm. So not only do we all work from home, we've been doing it for 7 years now, and we've shown that we could build a high-performing, highly diverse team being fully virtual. We design flexibility into a lot of the other basic questions around how work happens, not just from where, but for how long. Most organizations are stuck on this notion of an FTE as the unit of labor. And it turns out there's not a lot of evidence that points to 40 hours a week or 50 hours a week being optimally productive for humans. It just does, and we're 100 years after when this stuff should have been kind of really challenged and thrown out. So we think of a DTE, a desired time equivalent, and almost all salaried roles, people have the choice to be 100%, 3/4, full-time, 3/4 time, half-time. And we've constructed our work practices to allow these modules of time to be able to fit in. And then comp is prorated, so there's no cost to the business, but we've got teammates who are hyper-productive for 3/4 time, and being forced to work more than that would not be productive for them or their well-being, not good for the team. And then in other places, the only option is you're in an hourly role or you're stuck in your career. So flexibility is key. Transparency is key, particularly around how decisions are made that impact people's careers. When you're this diverse, you have to be open about everything and how things happen, because not only does a lack of transparency create unfairness, of course, but it also leaves people wondering about their job security or how they're doing, or not knowing what they need to move up. And so we've done some interesting work around just blowing up the typical performance review process and turning it into something much more kind of transparent and less subjective. We publish our management dashboard that the leadership team uses to run the business, about 40 KPIs. It's published to the whole organization, so everybody sees the exact same metrics that the leadership team is using. The notes from our leadership team meetings and actions are published. So there's just transparency as a kind of a more than a value of like, everybody should know how key decisions are made, because having that context allows you to do it better. A third dimension is just moving past well-being as this nice thing to kind of measuring it in a meaningful way, along with inclusion. We have a bot that polls our team at the end of every workday. As a group, we've defined the dimensions of well-being that are important to us, which link to including feeling a sense of belonging and connectedness and these ideas of inclusion. And we react to those polls. So once a quarter, we pick the 2 worst performing polls and then do something about it. We'll do deep dive kind of group sessions, deep dive surveys to get to root cause and then take action. I'll mention a kind of what that allows us to do. So a couple polls we had for a while were, and they're all statements that you respond to on a Likert scale. So I receive regular feedback from my team. That was one poll. And then I understand whether or not I'm meeting the expectation of my job. That was another poll. We thought these were the same thing because they were both the worst performing polls a couple of years ago. So we thought, well, let's fix the feedback issue and then the other thing will go away. First of all, fixing the feedback issue turned out to be not trivial. We thought, training. Let's train everybody on giving feedback, receiving feedback, right? Training doesn't change behavior. Useless. Not a bad start. Then we said, okay, maybe there's friction. It's hard. So we made it easy. Single commands in Slack for positive feedback, single commands to keep private notes, reminders and templates for your one-on-one check-ins. Just make it easy. That didn't work either. And then we tried to understand what the root cause of the problem was. And really, it was at the heart of who we're trying to be, which is we're trying to create this psychologically safe, supportive workplace. And peers and managers, it was up and down, were just hesitant to give critical feedback because they didn't want to, not knowing how it might be received. They're trying to help, so they don't want to hurt. Right. So they were erring on the side of caution. And then 2, because on our team, we're going to have just a wide range. Like you might be on an agile team and you have teammates who not only have physical differences, like 10% of our team have selective mutism, they do not speak. A large number of teammates might have auditory processing challenges. We ingest information differently, but also around mental health. We have teammates we over-index on generalized anxiety disorder or workplace PTSD. And so feedback might be a triggering event that ends badly, right? So while most managers are taught in most organizations some simple rules, right? If you're giving positive feedback, give it in public praise, or if you have critical feedback, give it in private, in a live conversation in the moment, and sandwich it between positive comments. It turns out that's not true. Like, that is not good. And the reason it's not good is because humans have different preferences. So, the answer for us was to incorporate a bunch of fields into a tool we've developed called the Biodex. Think of it like a quick start guide for working with a teammate. So it's like, here's how you need to work with me. It's got 20 fields and they're super pragmatic. It's not like Myers-Briggs stuff, right? Average response time on Slack. You should know that about working virtually, because if I Slack you and I'm waiting and I don't know how I'm waiting, then I might text you. That might trigger you, or so on. Or receiving critical feedback.
Rajesh, if I may, just a clarifying question. So do people provide that information about themselves so that others are aware of it?
Yes. And so step one, of course, is you have to create enough trust and safety that people will be honest, right?
Right.
But once you do that, then your polls are honest first. But also, like our Biodex tool, right? In the morning, the bot pings me to say, hey, how interactive are you feeling today? 1 to 10. I put that in. And then before I reach out to a colleague, I look up their interaction index, because on some days, people are just heads down working or stressed and don't want to be bothered, right? Or before I give feedback, I will look up their feedback fields in the Biodex, single command in Slack, super easy. And most people I find on our team don't want feedback in the moment in a live conversation, because they would prefer to have it at the end of the day or really at the end of the week. And these are fields you can pick, because it's going to throw them out, right? Most people would prefer to have it in writing, have the chance to digest, and then maybe have a live conversation if they have clarifying questions, versus being exposed to this critical, tough conversation live that's already stress-inducing. Anyway, I'll stop, but I would say the fourth dimension, and this is maybe the most important part, is to design inclusion into your core business practices. So here's what that looks like. I won't talk a lot about recruiting, but this audience probably knows that things like previous work experience or unstructured job interviews are useless. They have a very low correlation with on-the-job performance. There's plenty of studies that show this stuff, and yet that's what most organizations use. Use job tests, use structured interviews. We do that for all roles, not just entry-level roles, for all applicants, not just autistic applicants. This stuff has to be universal. We've authored a version of Agile that we call Inclusive Agile. And we have a set of tenets we've developed. We just published a paper in a peer-reviewed journal that takes the core practice of how we work and adapts it to a cognitively diverse group. We've authored a pedagogy around instructional design and training that we call Design for Neurodiversity, that creates training content and the delivery of that content and organization of learning paths in a way that works for all learners, not just some mythical median of a learner that doesn't exist. So all of this to say, really thinking about inclusion in terms of how you fundamentally redesign your core practices that bring people into the organization, that allow people to learn and grow in the organization, that allow people to work together and collaborate, is really the goal.
Wow. I mean, I am blown away. I've seen some comments in the screen, very interesting, and it's definitely generating a lot of thought. I'll say selfishly that if you have the code to crack the performance management question, that's an eternal HR and employment law conundrum. I may need to call you after this. After this
Well, can I say
panel.
one thing on this?
Yes, of course.
On performance reviews. So we're moving away from, so step one, of course, everyone should, already be decoupling coaching conversations and feedback from reviews and assessments. So you should all be doing that. I think most organizations are trying to move away from this idea of an annual performance review, but are stuck because how do you make decisions around comp increases or merit increases or promotions? We're halfway on that journey, and we're moving towards more of a model that looks more like an open source community where you have to demonstrate that you have the skills, it's validated by peers, it's reviewed by experts, and then you are ready. So it's much more community driven and employee driven versus sort of hostage to an annual process that's top down. But we used to do annual performance reviews, and we had a group of teammates who were particularly passionate about fixing performance reviews, form a working group, and they were empowered and they were given a brief, which is, okay, fine, make this more equitable and efficient, and come back, and we gave them some metrics of what that means. Anyway, they came back with 39 recommendations. We've adopted all of them. Some of them are blindingly obvious. So here's one. Every performance review I've ever had or done in any organization, I was at Microsoft, I was at Bain, has the same exact rating scale on inputs, which is from does not meet expectations to exceeds expectations, right? Okay,
Yeah.
so whose expectations are those? Did you bother to tell me what they were before the review period? Can you assure me that reviewer A's expectations are the same as reviewer B's? Because if not, this process is just flawed from the beginning. Anyway, so we've gotten rid of that scale the last time we did performance reviews, and replaced it with a simple yes or no, reframed all the questions to be competency based. So does person A consistently demonstrate competency B? Right? And these were worded so there were very little room for ambiguity. And then the best part is that the performance overall rating, which still is like, are you meeting expectations or exceeding or not, was calculated. If you got, n minus maybe 1 yeses from all your 360s and blah, guess what? You're exceeding expectations. End of story. No subjectivity. The line manager, of course, can override this, and in 10% of the cases they did, but it was always to move up one sort of ranking. All this to say, I think you have to just go back to like the basic tools we're using and question everything, because if you have a flawed foundation, none of the work you're going to do on top of it is going to be impactful.
So this is again fascinating, and it leads me to go back to Adrian when we talk about the importance of determining what to measure, and you're talking, Rajesh, about the pitfalls, right? In how the measurement questions or the metrics are framed, and so Adrian, I don't know if this delves a little bit into the philosophical, but I do think has incredibly practical implications. And it is when you're performing or applying data science to talent and to analyze the workforce, how do you balance what can be strictly measured versus what cannot be definitively measured, like an assessment of competency, perhaps?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so whenever we have discussions on TI dashboards or projects, we do emphasize as part of our narrative, and this is something we've aligned on with our DEI director, who really believes in this, that not all aspects of DEI can be effectively captured in data. You mentioned competencies. It's also, a lot of the outcomes related to inclusion training that a lot of companies are investing in. The outcomes might not show up for years. Development programs, for instance. We've been, as a company, we've been really investing in having this concept of be brave conversations about identity, really at all levels of the organization. And some of that outcome may or may not show up in our next engagement survey, but does it really matter? We know that it it is creating a cultural shift. So certainly, like, it is definitely something that we evangelize, even though it might not be the most natural coming from talent analytics. But we do believe when it comes to DEI that we want our DEI leader to own the soundtrack and really be the face of our tools and analysis. So in any discussion of data, she will talk through all the pillars of DEI and provide the caveat around how data measurement actually essential to our efforts, but we don't want to be blindsided and limited by overpivoting to analytics.
That's fantastic. And so as you were describing that and how there are things that you can objectively measure and measure them pretty quickly in terms of impact, there are other metrics that simply just by virtue of the nature take time. I can envision, for example, when you're describing training, what's the return on investment over time? There may be you may be able a year from now to correlate the level of satisfaction in some of these dimensions that Rajesh was mentioning to relative to the people who or the managers who have attended that training, right? But that takes a year before you, or maybe even more, before you actually see the results. So with that in mind, and the need for various levels of organizational patience at the leadership level, Brian, what tools are available for organizations to derive those actionable insights from qualitative data about employees' experience in the workplace, and particularly the experience of diversity and feeling included, belonging, and connected to the rest of the organization?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's something that we've actually set a little bit more of a framework around in terms of how we prioritize work that comes to our team, because there's definitely information that's available and it's interesting, and there's some things that we can't measure. And so we've actually set up somewhat of a framework that looks at data complexity or effort, and to your point, time, if it's something that maybe takes a little bit more time or is a little bit more hands-on and involves resources, and what's the potential impact. Digging into that data or providing insights or project work around that data will be able to impact the organization. And we tie that to the specific business outcomes and business strategies that we have, as well as some of our talent strategies. And so we use, different tools to look at how there's, movement within the organization. There's kind of a complex view that I'll give credit to one of our team members, Leo, for applying at Caterpillar, the ILM, or the internal labor market, that looks at, I think a lot of people that aren't as savvy from an analytics perspective look at it and it's a little bit hard to digest, but kind of what it really gets at is how there's what's happening with movement into the organization, upward in the organization, across and out. And it also kind of looks at where we have the ability to have more of an impact from a population size, and understanding what the dynamics are of that workforce, which gets at really some of the processes and policies that we may have had in place that we want to potentially shift, but it's going to take time to effectively move the needle and effectively measure that. I think one of the other tools that will become
and Brian, and you probably make that known, right, to the
oh yeah, yes.
Otherwise,
it's definitely, once we get to, I would say, HR folks that are a little bit more savvy and businesses that understand the value of talent analytics before we put something like that in front of them, because it does require that next level of consulting. And it is much more catered towards specific populations and specific, diverse populations we may want to be looking into. And then I think one of the other tools that will be helpful, and this is more in the process, and I know a lot of folks on the call have been involved in this, is the work we're doing to really identify how we measure our employment quality metrics and economic opportunity with the SEC requirements, because it's caused us to look at different aspects of what we would classify as economic opportunity, both as we're hiring people, as we're looking at them in the organization, and then even one that I personally struggled with, their ability to kind of market themselves and provide economic opportunity once they leave the organization. And so I think as we further flesh out some of those metrics, I think those will be some tools that will really allow us to maybe hone in on some real opportunity areas from a DE&I standpoint.
Wonderful. again, I'm just fascinated that we just can unpack so many of your statements and your experiences. And I want to make sure that we are cognizant of time. We only have 6 minutes left. I think there will be a little bit of time for people who want to remain. At least two of us are going to have to leave right at the top of the hour. So if I could ask Derek, are we going to be, or Deborah, are we going to be reading questions from the chat, or should I go ahead and ask? Because I have like 20 more questions to ask.
Yeah, I think there's a bunch in the Q&A. You could take a look at some of those.
I'm trying to find them here. Bear with me.
Right-hand corner.
I'm working from a mobile device here, and I am not seeing the questions, unfortunately.
Do you want me to read a couple?
Sure, that would be great. If you can read one that there's a common thread of multiple questions, that would be great.
These are from earlier. I'll just start at the beginning. What data collection thresholds, data entry rate, do you use to report on diversity dimensions? E.g., gender and race ethnicity is a pretty complete data set, but sexual orientation and disability may be missing responses from most of the employee population.
Yeah, and I think that's a great question, because I think every organization grapples with that, and there are different levels of willingness to self-disclose. So I'd be curious. I know, Rajesh, it sounded like you have certainly high participation of various types of the categories mentioned. And certainly I would love to hear what Adrian and Brian have to say as well.
So I don't have an answer to the question of like, what, you know, how do you get a level of participation in along some of these dimensions. I mean, at Alternauts, you know, we don't insist on proof of diagnosis, things like that. It's all it's disclosure based. When the diversity numbers that I mentioned, we do we just did a survey at the end of the year. We had a 70% participation rate, so it's fairly representative. But this is but on things like sexual orientation, even gender identity, we had, you know, a dozen different checkboxes, and many teammates picked more than one, right? So it's not so straightforward. On disability, we had a very long menu of things you could pick from, and most people pick many things. And so it's not only is it hard to actually get this data, so you know how you're doing, it's also not straightforward on how you even find the right meaningful categories.
Right. But it seems to me, Rajesh, and I would welcome, of course, Adrian and Brian to wrap it up as well, this thought, the fact that you've provided not just you have a disability as opposed to just do you have a disability, you've actually provided a longer menu and certainly have made an effort. It sounds to me like that's inviting and creating that sense of safety, right? That's something that you account for, and may lead to more people reporting that if you just put disability, yes or no. What do you think, Brian and Adrian?
Yeah, I was just gonna, it was covered, but we have to build kind of the trust and understanding of how that information is going to be used, as well as that level of comfort in actually self-reporting.
Yeah, and I actually just had a conversation with our benefits director on this topic today, just knowing that the data in SAP. So when people apply or start, right, you're usually asked to self-identify whether you have a disability, but a lot of people just don't, right? It's not mandatory. And in addition, how does that actually relate to accommodations? We actually think that the accommodations data is more valid, but that's in a third-party vendor, so it's not in our HRS system. We can get our hands on it, which is to think about maybe potentially joining it together to have a bigger picture, and maybe in combination of self-ID campaigns, because again, not everyone who is disabled needs accommodation either. So it's, you know, one is a diversity lens and one is an inclusion lens, but they're both important. So yeah, not a perfect solve, but we think we have a way to at least start capturing it.
Excellent. All right, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I think this has whetted a lot of appetites out there for this information. I have taken copious notes, and I may need to follow up with some of you for additional ideas. And I want to truly thank the TALREOS Workforce Science Project for organizing the event. We want to definitely thank our attendees for their interest. We wish we could get to every single question that you've asked. And I want to especially thank our panelists for their thoughtful answers and very informative narratives, right, from each of their perspectives. So I'll turn it over to Derek.
Thank you very much to everyone. Actually, there was a Rajesh. There was a question about where are you publishing? People would love to read the things that you were talking about. Is there somewhere we could direct people to?
No, but if you connect with me on LinkedIn, so like Inclusive Agile was published in Software Quality Professional, which if you're not, we don't have we're not good about having all of this stuff readily accessible, but I'm happy to share some of these articles with you guys, just if you connect with me on LinkedIn.
Great, that's fantastic. And I just wanted to share some information on our next webinar, which is coming up on April 15th, which everyone should be seeing on your screen now. So I know some of you have to go, so feel free to log off. And if anyone wants to stick around and answer any questions that come in via the Q&A or chat, that would be great.
Wonderful. I will sign off and I'll accept that. And again, it's been an honor to meet all of you and to be part of this dialogue.
Thank you, Manuel, very much. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm going to need to drop as well, but thanks for the opportunity and time today, everyone.
Great. Thank you. And let me stop the sharing here just to get the screen back. If there, are you guys seeing any? There's other questions in the Q&A. We will be posting the video, the recording on an unlisted YouTube link, and we'll distribute that. There was a question right towards the end. Assuming hiring is equitable, how do you address the wage gap, in particular for women? I'm not sure if either of you guys could address that. Maybe Deborah, if you wanted to come back on too to engage in the conversation, that would be great. I encourage anyone to send in if you have questions.
One of the questions was, how do you have any insights into how smaller companies that aren't rich in data tools can use analytics in the diversity context? Rajesh, I would imagine that you're probably not that large a company, or at least you weren't a large one very recently.
Yep. No, we are very much a small or mid-sized group. I mean, we don't have big data. Our core job, like our core, the work we do as software data quality engineers, we work with big data and tools. We don't have any of that because we're not big enough for any of this to be meaningful. I think it's just there's depending on the problem you're trying to solve, there's plenty of simple fixes or open source tools or plugins for whatever platform you're using. So I think it partly depends on what question are you trying to answer. And then I would guess there's a low tech or open source tool that you could use to the extent you need a way to collect or analyze that data.
Just to add to that, I think for a small company, just being aware of the demographics, probably individual contributor and leadership positions is probably a good first step, and maybe tracking it just simply in Excel on an infrequent basis, even whether it's once a year, might suffice. And I agree with if you have a handful of people who are ethnically diverse, maybe collapsing that. But certainly the energy today is around gender and ethnic diversity. So I would encourage organizations of any size to be able to track not just in percentages, but even the numbers, right? You can see the number of hires and the number of of departures. If you're seeing, you know, an imbalance between the two, then that's potentially an opportunity for intervention. Probably doesn't take a lot of effort, but still a decent ROI.
We have another question. Assuming hiring is equitable, how do you address the wage gap, especially for women?
I think that's a question a lot of us would love to answer, and I'm not sure we have to.
Without a solid answer, what do you try? Without an answer, what are you exploring, I guess, at least? What are your tools for addressing the,
Yeah, I mean, we are looking at performance and compensation, and seeing whether there are differences by those demographics, but not jumping to any conclusions, right? So if we see a difference in performance, like is there truly a wage gap? Is it, you know, or is it like truly performance driven? We're not sure. So we are bringing in where we can measure performance, sales data, operations data to really pinpoint what the potential issues are. And in addition to that, we are using text analytics to look heavily at performance review results. So pretty unstructured data to understand, like, are there potential biases, both in terms of like self-biases, right? Because my understanding from a lot of articles is that women tend to give themselves lower ratings and promote themselves less. And are there biases in terms of the, you know, the comments that are provided to women, you know? And from there, I think we can, that's a good starting point to uncover, is this systematic?
did you have any, when you looked into the self-reporting bias, did you find that? Did you find women were more self-deprecating, or too soon to?
So we're just getting started with that and scoping it out.
You know, I would say for us, again, we're small, so and we don't have a pay gap. What we look at is if there are around, let's say, on any of these dimensions, but we have fairly tight banding or salary banding around roles, and we've got micro career steps, so you can progress from level 1 to level 2 in relatively short periods of time, and super explicit requirements of what you need to do to get from level 1 to level 2. So transparency always helps. And we do, though, look at if somehow there are patterns in the pace of progression, because when we look at the organization overall, the leadership team is 50-50 in terms of gender, middle management skews more female. So, you know, we don't have a gender gap per se. And it's not a dimension we've looked at a lot, but I think looking at career progression is more interesting. I think in general can get to some of the leading indicators that you might have a problem. And I think to Adrienne's point, you know, analyzing things like performance reviews, like we actually, our core business is software and data quality engineering. We spun up a talent bias audit service where we apply our kind of analytical techniques that we might use working with the chief data officer and their data science team to analyze the kind of data exhaust being generated throughout the employee lifecycle. And we're started our first few engagements. But one of the simplest things to do, it's super interesting, is to actually do the, you know, analysis of the unstructured data, the text in the performance reviews. And it's not hard to build sort of a company-specific lexicon, a dictionary of biased words that you can then use, you know, in future cycles to automate some of these quality checks to make sure that if there are patterns resurfacing, you can catch them early.
I have a question for Rajesh. A lot of what you say, what you mentioned, just seems like really great management. If you had to take one thing that you do differently and say, look, even if most of your workforce is neurotypical, you should try this, what would it be?
Honestly, there's nothing we do that's not that, right? It's like, hey, use job tests for recruiting.
Yep.
You know, It's like blindingly obvious, right? Let people communicate in a channel that is productive and efficient for them, not always using voice or calls. So I don't. I think everything we're doing, ultimately the filter, the sort of litmus test is this going to make work better for everyone? And does it root out a particularly destructive aspect of work for some set of colleagues?
If anybody has any other questions, why don't you put them into the chat? Otherwise, I think we're just about ready to wind up. Well, thank you all so very, very much. This has been an incredible session. Thank you, Rajesh, Adrian, and Manuel and Brian, who weren't here, but thank you. And thank you all to everybody who came. We look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Deborah.
you.
Thanks, Eric.
Thanks for your leadership, Deborah.
Thanks for having us. Bye.
Bye-bye.